This isn't fiction. It's the chilling reality millions of medieval peasants faced every winter. Tonight, we unravel the brutal truth behind how these forgotten souls battled bone-shattering cold, suffocating darkness, and death itself fall without heaters, thick blankets, or even proper floors. This isn't the medieval fantasy you've read in fairy tales. This is raw, ruthless survival. For 90% of the population, winter wasn't about merriment. It was a nightly negotiation with death. Might picture knights in shining armor and castles glittering with warmth. Oh, that's royalty.
Sighed.
Their crumbling huts, no insulation, no windows, no mercy. The cold didn't knock, it moved in. Layers of itchy wool that barely kept out the wind and definitely didn't keep out death. Walls were made of sticks and dung. Fireplaces, smoldering pile of wet logs. Beds, just sacks of straw and fleas. Clothes, every breath felt like inhaling ice daggers. Every night became a deadly test. Hypothermia crept into bones, thatched and rotting. After months of rain and snow, it sagged and collapsed. Sometimes a squirrel or bird would fall onto your stew. No joke, vermin were part of dinner and drama. Waking up was a miracle. Frostbite stalked toes. It whispered in your ear at midnight, daring you to survive till morning. Still want to complain about your drafty apartment? Called wattle and daub. Peasant homes were made of crisscross sticks smeared with mud and dunked cheap. Sticky, and the only barrier between your children and the storm clawing outside. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in soot? But winter had no respect for their effort. The wind found every crack, danced through gaps. Not wood, just bare dirt. If done right, they'd survive until morning. If not, and when all else failed, they huddled together like snarling, shivering animals just to see the sun again. When it snowed or rained, it turned to mud. So yes, you had indoor water features, but you didn't appreciate them. You're lying in a living, squishy grave of old grass and insects, bugs, rats, fleas. When you're one breath away from death, fragrance takes a back seat to not freezing, and the faint perfume of goat. And they faced it every night with nothing but smoke, rags, and a stubborn refusal to die. Congratulations, you're in the peasant's version of a 5-star suite. No, it wasn't optional. It was as important as guarding a newborn. And the roof. The air froze from above. Your breath froze in your lungs. A 3-dimensional war on your body heat. Elders vanished in the night. Whole families were found by neighbors in spring-frozen an embrace, huddled like statues of desperation. The floor, the ground, froze from below. Yet these peasants didn't cry. They patched walls with moss, jammed rags into gaps, smeared more dung when the old layer crumbled. Medieval peasants didn't live in their homes. They endured them. At night, the fire barely burned. There was no chimney, just smoke curling around your face, stinging your eyes, poisoning your lungs, but you didn't mind that smoke. It kept the fleas away. The fire was more than warmed, it was life. Lose it, and you lost the war flint, steel, dry kindling, shaking hands. A whispered prayer. So they learned to bank fire. At night, they'd bury glowing embers under ashes like fragile treasure. Let's just say, morning came with frostbite. Some families rotated fire duty, staying up at 2 a.m. just to check on glowing coals, straw stuffed in sacks, moldy rushes layered over dirt. Even worse, that straw flattened fast, then it decomposed. So you're not just lying on a mattress. Yet, this mess insulated, it saved lives. So they kept layering. Some added herbs like lavender to mask the smell. Others didn't bother. Children died. If you think that's dark, good, because it was. And if you were a medieval peasant, every snowflake carried the whisper of death. Forget the snow globe version of history. The real past wasn't pretty. It was brutal, unforgiving, and cold enough to break the human soul. Yet somehow, the poorest of the poor didn't just survive. They defied nature's wrath with nothing but willpower, mud, and sheer stubbornness. You didn't sleep. You didn't dream. You endured. Each morning you opened your eyes and felt your heartbeat. It wasn't just routine, it was victory. Because in the heart of winter, death didn't knock. It waited in the rafters, curled beside your sleeping child, and listened for silence. It made the bravest fathers cry silently in the dark, because they couldn't stop the chill from creeping into their children's bones. It swallowed infants in their sleep. It snapped at old bones with glee. No rescue, You either adapted or became history's forgotten. Footnote, there was no cavalry. Peasants treated fire like royalty, guarded, honored, and feared. Livestock weren't kept in barns. They were invited into the bedchamber. Not because anyone liked the smell, but because animal heat was better than no heat. And you just sat there, shaking in your layered rags, trying to pretend you were still alive. They didn't have fireplaces. They had smoke pits. Not chimneys, just holes in the roof that begged the cold to come in for dinner. Parents scolded children not for running, but for breathing wrong. That's how serious the cold was. Still, they worshipped the flame, because without it, their bodies became tombs, still trying to breathe. A house wasn't made of safety. It was sticks, dung, desperation. And maybe if you were lucky, a patch of animal skin nailed to a hole, pretending to be a window. They were ongoing war zones made of grit and garbage, where losing insulation meant losing limbs. It was alive with fleas, mold, and a dampness that clung to your soul like regret. The wind didn't knock politely. It ripped through the walls like a blade. You stank of smoke, sweat, and sheep. Every step they took in the freezing mud was a step away from becoming another forgotten corpse in the snow. That wasn't a joke. That was a tactic. So yes, medieval bedtime meant lying on straw next to a cow, while your aunt snored and a chicken nested on your foot. You wore every layer you owned, even if it made you look like a human onion with fleas. Fashion? But it kept you breathing. And in winter, that was the only trend that mattered. They didn't quit. They didn't even have the luxury of complaining. Their enemy was nature, and their greatest weapon was each other. Breathing too hard meant sucking ice directly into your lungs. Even respiration was a battleground. And so peasants fought with everything they had. Moss, straw, old cloth, goat, dung, anything that could fill a hole or patch a gap. Their homes weren't homes. You never knew if you'd wake up with frost-bitten fingers or not wake up at all. The straw mattress, and still, it was better than the floor. Every day they beat back winter like it was a monster made of frost and silence. They weren't surviving. They were spitting in the face of nature itself. And yet they didn't fold. They just adapted, layer by layer, ember by ember, prayer by prayer. Every scar, a chapter in the Cold War against winter. Imagine sleeping wrapped in every piece of clothing you own, pressed against the shivering bodies of your family, with a goat breathing behind your ear and a rat running over your leg, being grateful for it. That was winter. Your battlefield was their home. Body heat became a lifeline. Community became armor. The fire wasn't just a source of heat, it was the beating heart of the house. They passed down fire-starting methods like sacred spells. They banked coals like treasure. They prayed over embers like they were children, because they understood. No ember, no tomorrow. Each cracked hand, each frozen toe, each smoky breath they wore like medals. Every wrinkle was a story of survival. They weren't trying to live, they were trying not to die. And yet they were still part of the story, part of the strength, because those who survived carried their memory forward into the next frost, the next blizzard, the next deadly season. They lived for them. Think of the woman stuffing moss into a crack with bare, bleeding fingers. Think of the man laying a hot rock under a straw bed just to keep his baby warm. Think of the family huddled in the dark, whispering prayers into the wind, hoping they make it one more night. They didn't build cathedrals or write epic poems, but they fought battles every night with nothing but straw, fire, and a will made of iron. And they won. For medieval peasants, this was a nightly reality. The wind didn't just rattle the door, it clawed through the walls. The fire didn't glow. For comfort, it flickered as a final defense line against death. Just frozen toes, aching joints, and the fear that the fire might die, and take you with it. That's why nobody truly slept. They couldn't afford to. They slept in shifts, fighting the cold in turns like a ragtag army against the icy night. And when it was finally your turn to sleep, you didn't sleep. You twitched, you shook, you hoped to make it to dawn without freezing solid. No alarms, no 5 more minutes. If you were old enough to hold a stick, you were old enough to prod embers and pray they didn't go dark. The peasants learned to breathe through their noses, slow, shallow, silent. It wasn't relaxation, it was survival. Yeah. No one was too young to help. No one was allowed to rest too long. Grandparents, half crippled with arthritis, stayed up by the fire not by choice. But because lying down hurt worse than sitting awake in the cold, this wasn't cozy. It was warfare, fought with fire pokers and whispers. And if freezing air didn't kill you, starvation might. Breathe too deeply, and the cold stabbed your lungs like knives. Children were scolded for breathing too loudly. Why? Because gasping mouthfuls of icy air could kill you faster than hunger. They wrapped rags around their faces to warm their breath, waking up with damp cloths frozen to their lips. It looked ridiculous. It felt miserable, but it saved lives. Breathing was a discipline. It might break a toe or worse, set your house on fire. It oozed up from the ground, seeped in through the walls, and stole warmth from the inside out. A warm rock was a medieval electric blanket. One glowing stone meant the difference between shivering in the dark and holding on to hope. They mattered. Everyone else arranged themselves around them like human insulation. So peasants fought back with the only weapon they had: food. Too far, you turned into a popsicle. Root vegetables like onions, turnips, and parsnips were life-saving bricks of heat, not ingredients. Every meal was a battlefield strategy. Even a chunk of lard could be the difference between survival and frostbite. A belly full of porridge or stew meant your body could burn calories to stay warm. Forget Instagram-worthy plating. This was food designed to sit heavy in your gut and burn slow like coal. Their smell not so helpful. Kids who didn't like turnips? It's too bad. You either ate it or you froze, wishing you had. And then came the hot stone. Yes, a stone. They heated rocks in the fire until they glowed, wrapped them in rags, and slipped them into straw beds like crude heating pads. Boots? No one bathed unless a priest came to visit or someone died. Soap was rare. Water was frozen. Rags tied with rope. Every grease patch meant warmth. Roofs leaked. Snow got in. Rain poured through the thatch. Gloves. Whatever was left of last year's leather belt. If you wrapped it wrong, you got burned. If you dropped it, yes, they slapped poop on walls like it was paint. No, but done right. It was a miracle. You slept close to the fire or died. The elderly and infants got prime positions. They were fragile. It was too close to the fire. You risked waking up with your hair on fire. Some families took turns waking up all night, checking the fire, shifting spots. Every inch mattered. Every ember was sacred. And if the cold didn't kill you, the stench might. Because guess who shared the bedroom? The more filth layered on you, the warmer you stayed. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Layered. They prayed. They endured. Neighbors knocked and found only silence. Children vanished in the snow. Elders drifted to sleep and never woke. Cows, goats, chickens, pigs, not just for fun, but for warmth. Their body heat mattered. So did their snoring. But in this war, a stinky cow breath in your face was better than frostbite. The livestock earned their place. They weren't just animals. They were furry, smelly radiators with hooves. You have unknown claustrophobia until you've slept between a farting uncle and a judgmental goose. But peasants didn't care. Privacy wasn't a luxury. It wasn't even a word. Families slept together stacked in layers, like desperate snoring lasagna. Whoever moved too much risked knocking someone into a freezing draft and becoming the family villain. And still, they endured. They wore everything they owned at once. Not for looks, but to avoid death. Wool tunics, scratchy cloaks, even greasy sheepskins. They stank, but stink kept the heat in. Dirt, grease, even body odor became insulation. No one washed their clothes. Better to smell like hell than freeze like heaven. The dirt hardened like armor. Their clothes became filthy shields against the cold. Every stain told a story. Walls crumbled. They patched holes with moss, straw, animal, hairy van cold manure. And why not? It helped seal out death. It slipped through any crack it could find. It rattled shutters. It pushed its way under doors. They couldn't stop it, but they could fight back. They stuffed rags in gaps, packed mud between boards. They didn't cry. They didn't whine. They muttered, "This is fine," as they slapped frozen cow dung onto walls, and meant it. And yet, even with fire, food, animals, and filth, some winters still won. The cold wasn't just cruel, it was unstoppable. Families froze together in their straw beds. But still, they fought. They patched. In medieval winter, Closing your eyes meant risking everything. If you weren't the one keeping watch over the fire, you were the one depending on someone else's fading strength to stay alive. Because in that pitch-black silence, fires didn't go out with a bang. They died with a whisper. And if the embers went cold, so did your body. Someone always had to stay awake, poking at dying coals, blowing on embers, feeding wood that was too wet to burn. Their eyes stung from smoke, their fingers bled from frost, their hearts raced, not from fear but from freezing. And if they dozed off, you could wake to silence, the kind that meant the fire was out and someone had already slipped away in their sleep. It seeped through stone. It crawled across floors. It didn't bite all at once, it gnawed, slow and cruel, like hunger. A toe, then a finger, then the whole limb stiffened like wood. Fathers knew. The silence in the morning was louder than any storm. By the time you noticed, it was too late. No one wrote down how many infants didn't survive winter. No one counted the number of frozen cradles. You gave it all, or you gave up. But the mothers knew. Some wrapped their babies in sheepskin. Others tucked them inside their own clothes, because nothing, not even your own warmth, was yours in winter. Out there was where the wind had a name, and it was death. Rain turned the inside into a swamp. Men who had fought wars, tilled fields, and lifted oxen to safety would crumble at the sight of their family shivering beside a dying fire. You couldn't punch the cold. You couldn't outrun it. You could only resist. And resistance, night after night, took a toll no one could see, but everyone felt. Air whistled through cracks like knives through skin. Doors didn't seal. Roofs didn't hold. Snow snuck in sideways. And still it was better than being outside. You shook harder. The poor. They foraged frozen branches, burned furniture. Because heat was hope, no matter how it smelled. Ripped beams from barns. Even spoiled meat got boiled and eaten. Because warmth from rot was still warmth. Your skin went gray. Children on laps. Elders under rags. Animals in the mix. You'd wake from visions of fire going out or ice filling your lungs or snow falling through the roof onto your face. You couldn't think, move, or pray, because out there, a belly without food became a fireless furnace. Because in a world where the elements didn't care, faith was sometimes the only warmth you could feel. It meant someone was still watching, still hoping, still trying. So every scrap mattered. Every crumb of bread. Every root vegetable buried under the floor. Some families whispered about giving up, about walking into the woods, about lying down and letting go. But most kept fighting. For a child to breathe, not one. They were lit during birth, death, and fire duty. They dug holes for frozen turnips. They boiled leather straps. They chewed bark like wolves. One more night. One more matchstick's worth of flame. They didn't carve their names in stone, 'cause death could knock, but they didn't have to answer. The rich had stocks of timber, and when that ran out, they burned manure. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. There was no such thing as sleeping alone. In winter, not unless you wanted to die. You didn't cuddle for comfort. You huddled for heat. 3 people to a bed, 6 people in a corner. It wasn't cozy. It was crowded, sweaty, and full of coughing, but it was alive. If you managed to sleep, it wasn't restful. But you still woke up. That was what counted. Because in winter, waking up was a luxury. People prayed not for riches or rain, but for a warm night. For a little more wood, for a neighbor to survive. Churches echoed with whispered pleas, not hymns, and yet they believed. A single candle meant you weren't alone, so candles were never wasted. A flame in the dark was more than light, it was defiance. Chickens stopped laying. Goats stopped moving. Some froze standing. Others huddled beside humans. The line between beast and man blurred, because in the cold, everyone was equal. Some didn't make it. Their names didn't go on gravestones. Their stories didn't fill books. But their survival paved the way for those who followed. Their courage wasn't glamorous. It was muddy, smoke-stained, frostbitten, and real. One more breath. And that's what made them warriors, not because they fought armies, but because they outlived the cold. They didn't invent grand machines, but they conquered something greater than kingdoms. They conquered the night. Anne Boleyn didn't start as a queen. She started as an idea. A spark, a storm in a world that demanded women whisper. And yet she became the center of England's most scandalous, earth-shaking love story and its most ruthless betrayal. But behind the silk dresses and jeweled crowns was a ticking clock counting down to ruin. She dazzled like no woman the English court had ever seen. Fluent in French, educated in diplomacy, trained in charm, wit, and power plays from the finest courts in Europe, she refused. Anne didn't just enter a room. She rewired its energy. He made promises. He offered everything except what she demanded most: marriage. And when King Henry VIII saw her, Ely saw her hurt, was the beginning of a national crisis. Henry had mistresses. He was used to taking what he wanted. But Anne didn't melt. She didn't beg. And that refusal was like fire to Henry's obsession. He wrote letters. Anne wasn't playing for romance. She was playing for a crown. And she was willing to change history to get it. King Henry was already married to Catherine of Aragon, queen beloved by the people, and fiercely protected by the most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor. He turned on his advisors. He turned on tradition. To marry Anne, Henry would have to break from the church itself, and he did. She leaned in guiding, advising, shaping the crown as it slipped onto her head. When her daughter Elizabeth was born, Anne smiled, but Henry's joy died a little inside. Henry turned on the Pope, all for Anne. She didn't just sit quietly, but crowns come heavy. And this one would bleed. Pressure was unbearable. She knew it. Everyone knew it, she promised. The next would be a boy. It wasn't. There were miscarriages, heartbreak, blood, silence, and slowly Henry turned away. Just rumors, lies, and a king looking for an exit. Her fire became fury. Her wit became witchcraft. The court that once bent around her started whispering behind her. Then came Jane Seymour, soft, obedient, everything Anne wasn't. Henry was slipping through Anne's fingers, and she knew it. She tried to win him back. She tried everything. But the man who had changed the world for her had changed himself instead. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest partner in the Reformation, now saw her as a threat. Anne wanted power for the poor. Cromwell wanted control for the crown. He chose the crown. And to kill a queen, he didn't need poison, she knew. She would not be remembered as a sinner. The charges were grotesque. Adultery, incest, treason. Anne was accused of seducing multiple men, including her own brother. There was no proof. There didn't need to be. She walked to the scaffold with fire still in her eyes. No coffin, no ceremony, just silence. The trial was a farce. The verdict was pre-written. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Anne stood in court, calm and proud. She denied it all. But her fate had already been sold. She was dragged to the tower, no longer queen, just a woman with days to live. She prayed. Not for rescue, but for mercy. She comforted her weeping ladies. She joked bitterly about her fate. She would be remembered as a symbol. And then came the sword. Henry, in a flash of kindness, hired a French swordsman for a swift death. She showed the world that a woman could rise, rule, and terrify empires. On May 19, 1536, Anne, dressed with car-gray gown, fur trim, crimson skirt, she didn't beg, she didn't cry, she forgave. The sword flashed. In stories, the bloodline of a queen who ruled for decades. And Anne Boleyn was no more, buried in an unmarked grave. But history doesn't bury storms, because the child she bore, the one who disappointed a king, would rise to become Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most powerful monarchs the world has ever known. Anne had failed to give Henry a son, but she gave England a queen. Her legacy didn't just survive, it triumphed. She helped tear England away from Rome. She reshaped the monarchy. Anne wasn't forgotten. She was reborn in portraits. Anne's brilliance couldn't be erased by betrayal. Her spirit, sharp, stubborn, glorious still, echoes through every crown England ever wore. In Anne Boleyn's rise was nothing short of a miracle, but her fall, it was a masterpiece of betrayal. She had rewritten the rules, rewrote England's religion, rewrote the definition of a queen. And for that, The world rewrote her fate in blood. Anne wasn't docile. She wasn't silent. She was lightning in a corset, sharp-tongued, unyielding, and strategic. The court couldn't control her. The church couldn't silence her. Even the king couldn't always predict her. And when a woman dares to rise in a man's world, the knives come out fast. She spoke when others whispered. She challenged when others bowed. She had opinions on politics, religion, and the economy, topics that could get a man beheaded, let alone a woman. He swore he'd wait 7 years for her love. To her enemies, she wasn't a queen. She was a threat that wore a crown. Henry once penned letters filled with longing and obsession. Her crest was torn down, her initials scraped from stone. But when that love soured, the ink turned poisonous. The man who once wrote, "I love you above all others," now scribbled his signature on her death sentence. Portraits vanished. The court didn't just want her gone. They wanted her to never have existed. A woman who changed a king's mind and the fate of a nation. Even as she stood trial, accused of sins she never committed, Anne stared down her accusers. She didn't plead, she didn't cry. She stood with fire in her eyes and dared history to remember the truth. A woman who rose from the ashes of servitude. A woman who said no. To the old guard, she was proof that women could rule hearts, minds, and kingdoms, and that scared them more than war. And Cromwell gave it. He used something far more lethal: gossip, rumor, and fear. The court needed a villain, and Anne wore the mask. All accused of sleeping with the queen, all declared guilty. All executed. He didn't stab her. He didn't poison her. He whispered Anne's guilt into the king's ears, and Henry swallowed it whole. No witnesses could prove her guilt. No facts could stick. But it didn't matter. Justice was never on the guest list. 5 men and an HS, forced to watch them die before her own fate arrived. Each beheading carved a little deeper into her legacy. Anne spent her final days in the Tower, not crying, but praying. She forgave Henry, not because he deserved it, but because she didn't want him to have the final piece of her soul. Her back straight, her voice calm. "I am the king's true wife," she said, "and none but God shall judge me." And then silence. The sword flashed once, and England held its breath. No coffin, no ceremony, no justice. A queen reduced to a whisper in the stone floor of a chapel, not forgotten. She broke a church. She broke the silence. The daughter she gave birth to, the one the king didn't want, grew up to become Elizabeth, the greatest monarch in English history. She never married. She never bowed. She never forgot. And in every law she passed, every battle she won, Anne's blood thundered in her veins. A glimpse of what women could be: smart, strategic, and strong enough to shake an empire. And her ghost haunted every monarch who followed her. Not in fear, but in awe. Anne's voice may have been cut off at the scaffold, but her impact echoed for centuries. She broke a king. And she made space for a world where queens could rule without apology. History called her guilty, but legacy called her necessary. And in the end, Anne Boleyn wasn't remembered for her death. She was remembered for the fire she lit. A fire that still burns. That's all it took to ignite a revolution that would change the world. Not a battlefield, not a king's decree, but tea. Thousands of pounds of it drowning silently in the cold, dark waters of Boston Harbor. It was December 16th, 1773, the night when rage boiled over into rebellion. And it didn't sound like thunder or cannon fire, it sounded like crates splashing into the sea. Britain thought it still ruled America. Boston thought otherwise. The Tea Act wasn't just a tax, it was an insult, a final shove to people already teetering on the edge. Parliament believed colonists would accept cheaper tea, but they misunderstood something far more important than economics. This wasn't about price, it was about power, accepting that tea meant surrendering the right to be free. The colonies had begged, protested, reasoned, and still they weren't heard. Townshend Acts, troops in the streets, blood on Boston cobblestones. Stamp Act, they sent letters, sent boycotts, but the Crown sent silence. And when silence screamed louder than justice, something ancient woke up inside the American people. The Sons of Liberty didn't riot. They planned. They met in secret. They whispered resistance. They turned taverns and churches into war rooms. They watched as 3 ships arrived: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, and sat in the harbor like loaded weapons. And when the deadline came, they moved. They dressed not as rebels, but as symbols, stood on their faces, blankets over their shoulders, feathers tucked into their hair, not to deceive, but to declare, we are no longer subjects, or something new. That night, they boarded the ships, quiet, swift, unstoppable, and they didn't steal, they didn't burn. They simply opened crates 3. 142 of the man poured tyranny into the sea. The smell of tea filled the air like incense before a revolution. Not one window broken, not one person harmed, only a message: will not be ruled. By morning, the world had changed. The tea was gone. The British were stunned, enraged, humiliated. No ships stripped, troops quartered in homes, justice sent back to London. No trade, no lifeblood. King George III didn't see an act of protest. He saw war, and Parliament struck back with fury. The intolerable acts weren't just punishment, they were a declaration. Boston's harbor was shut down. Merchants became generals. Printers became poets of war. Self-governance. Britain didn't want Boston to suffer. It wanted Boston to kneel. But Boston didn't fall. America stood up. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, wagons rolled in with food, firewood, and letters of defiance. 12 colonies united for the first time, not as rivals, but as brothers in resistance. The First Continental Congress was born. They fought for a world that didn't yet exist. And a nation began to breathe. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a tantrum, it was a tipping point. The British thought fear would break them. But in trying to crush Boston, they forged America. Rebellion echoed louder than tea splashes. Farmers became soldiers. They didn't fight for revenge. And the reckoning came faster than anyone expected. The colonies gathered. They debated. They argued. But through it all, one truth grew louder than any division. Freedom wasn't given. It had to be taken. So when you sip tea, remember it wasn't always cozy. It was once a battle cry, a reason for war, a symbol of blood and resistance. And in the ink-stained fingers of printers, in the scarred hands of farmers, and in the burning hearts of rebels, liberty was born. When those crates hit the water, it wasn't about taxation anymore. It was a declaration, a warning, message carved in cold waves and midnight silence. We will not bow. It was quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the electric stillness before something breaks. A storm without thunder, fuse without flame, and it was lit by hands disguised in feathers and resolve. They weren't hiding behind disguises. They were stepping into their ancestors. They wore the face of resistance, of land taken, of power stripped. By dressing as Mohawk warriors, the Sons of Liberty weren't mocking, they were mourning. Boots thudding against the deck. Splash, splash, splash. And now, they were taking it back, one crate at a time. Axes cracking open wooden boxes. Each crate of tea hit the water like a cannonball of defiance. These weren't soldiers. They were merchants, farmers, blacksmiths, teenagers. But they were done begging, were done writing letters to a king who treated them like children. And that night they didn't write history. They threw it into the ocean. Because for too long they'd been choking on taxes, on tyranny, on the sour taste of being unheard. And when they dumped that tea, it wasn't just a protest. It was an exorcism. The silence of colonists who were told to be grateful for scraps. And on that night, the colonies were no longer 13 distant outposts. They were one fist, clenched in defiance, striking the heart of empire. That night, Boston became the matchstick. Canned America became the flame. Crush them he did. Port closed. Troops increased. Laws tightened like a noose. But what the crown didn't understand was, revolution thrives in pressure. The silence of slaves, the silence of women, silence of workers. That night, the water roared louder than Parliament. Tea wasn't the product. Obedience was. And by drowning it, they told the world, we are no longer your subjects. We are our own masters. They knew what would come next. Blood, war, death, but they did it anyway. Not for fame, not for riches, but for the right to say no to a king who thought oceans were walls and subjects were property. The Boston Tea Party was a whisper in the dark. But whispers spread. They climb walls. They cross borders. And when loud enough, they become the scream of revolution. Tyrants took notice. Poets took notes. Slaves dared to dream. The idea that ordinary people could defy a throne spread like wildfire. Tea was trade. Tea was order. Tea was control. Down now tea was rebellion. Every cup brewed after that night carried the scent of war. That's what revolution looks like. Not flags waving, but hearts waking. They risked hanging, imprisonment, war. For the dream of something they'd never seen but knew must exist. A nation where no king ruled the soul. There was no constitution yet, no president, no Congress, just a harbor full of soggy tea and hearts set on fire. And those cold, determined men chose to stand, and history bent around their decision. 'Cause when those crates hit the water, a kingdom trembled, and a country began to rise.